So hi, good evening. Now let me start sharing my screen. All right. So today we'll be talking about data privacy, health information privacy. No? So privacy and the role of ethics in the processing of personal information. So at the end of this module, no, our hope is that you'll be able to appreciate the importance of data privacy, identify what are general data privacy obligations and what are the rights of data subjects, and you understand the application and relevance of ethical principles, and in some way that you are able to practice data privacy in your everyday lives. Okay, so before we start, no, we'll have a few poll questions first. Okay, so hopefully you'll be seeing the poll questions in the screen now. Okay, so please answer them. So do you have a social media account? Maybe Facebook, Twitter, Instagram? Okay. 100% ng mga sumagot ay meron. Okay, next poll question. Okay. Bawa, Starbucks card, National Bookstore. Ano pa ba yung mga cards na mga meron? Oh, yeah, you know those reward cards or loyalty cards where you sign up, then on your birthday, you might receive a free gift. If you collect enough points, you can claim those points. Okay. So, what is our result? No? So, around 76% of you have these kinds of cards. Now, next question. Have you tried face apps? Halimbawa, gusto mong malaman how you will look like in 10 years. How you would look like as the opposite sex. Alam niyo mga lumalabas sa social media where you get to try out things and they will use your photo for it. So, okay. So marami-rami ang hindi pa gumamit nun. Okay, next question. What's our next question? So do you use your social media? Sometimes just one account to log in to other sites. Sometimes it's easier. When you install a new app or you visit a website, they will ask you, log in with your Facebook account. Log in with whatever account, and then you don't have to enter info anymore, because if you just click it, then automatically you get logged in. Okay. So a majority do this, and I think the final question would be, okay, do you read the terms and conditions before agreeing to it? When you download an app, or like the Face app, no? Pag ginamit mo yun, or you take a Facebook quiz, or you use some other app, do you read the terms and conditions? Or when you signed up to the rewards card or loyalty cards, did you actually read the terms and conditions before you agreed to it? Okay, let's see. All right. No? Minsan kasi ang haba-haba ng mga terms and conditions, no? Or they'll ask you to click on something before you have that link. Okay? So at least we have an idea of where we, the participants here now, are in terms of use of social media. Meron silang sinasabing privacy paradox. No? Sometimes we know and understand that our privacy is important, but in the way we do it in actual everyday activities, it doesn't reflect it. Okay? So, yun yung intro natin for the topic of health information, ICT, and privacy risks. All right, so now you have an idea of how it is, how your information is being collected based on your current practices. So this is important because right now they say that we are in the fourth industrial revolution. No? So what does this mean? No? These are the changes, no? The disruptions, the new technologies that change the way we do everyday things. So from the 1700s when they had the steam engine to electricity in the 1800s and computers in the 1900s. Now this is a new age. No? This one is not just dependent on like surfing on the internet, but it's actually connectivity. This is the age of big data, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things. You use smart devices. Almost everything is on the cloud. You store it there. You for convenience. No, your devices are connected to each other. You are connected to your devices. There are bitcoins, cryptocurrency, all these new technologies. No, we hear of smart technologies, smart cities. So this is the age that we are in now, and this age depends on the value of information and technology. No? There's so much available information, and with the advancements in technology, we are able to find more meaningful uses to it. Okay. So imagine now in the health field, no? There was an article that said that, you know, an artificial intelligence can actually predict heart attacks and strokes more accurately than standard doctors' methods. It's like if you had the choice, would you trust an artificial intelligence to tell you that you might have a heart attack or you might have a stroke over a doctor? No? But how does artificial intelligence work? No? So for this particular study, I'll give you an idea of what happens. No? So here in this study, what they did was they studied around more than 300,000 medical records. No? So from these medical records, they fed this into a machine so that the machine can learn from it, okay, machine learning, and then they would like try to find patterns. And from the patterns that they discovered, they found characteristics of those who would usually have heart attacks or stroke, and they created an algorithm to make these predictions. Now, the algorithm that they developed, they applied it on the rest of the medical records. They tried to see whether based on the algorithm that they developed, they would be able to predict which of these medical records actually ended up, which of these patients actually ended up having heart attacks or stroke. They then compared this with the results if instead of the algorithm, the guidelines from a specialty society were used. So based on the results, they found that the machine or the artificial intelligence was able to predict more heart attacks than the standard guidelines for doctors. So this is just one example of the potentials of information. No? There are a lot of uses, but more than these emerging technologies, even if we just look at how the health sector uses information now, we would realize its value. For instance, I'd like you to think now of what would it be like during the pandemic if we had no access to information. So contact tracing, the management of the pandemic would depend on collection of information, using it, whether it's to make policies, monitor programs, and specifically to manage the disease. You want to know whether a person is positive, who are the people who may have been exposed to the person, how many may have been infected so that they can be identified, isolated, probably treated. So now imagine if you had no access to this information, no? How would it impact the way that we are able to manage the pandemic? Now, another scenario is in the hospital. No? What are the uses of health information in the hospital? So, of course, primary purpose is medical treatment. When a patient comes into the hospital, you collect his or her information and you use this information to make a diagnosis and to propose management of the patient's condition. But more than medical treatment, a facility will usually have a lot of uses of the information. For instance, information about patients may be used for research. It may be used to train students educational purpose of students. It may be used to train residents practicing a particular specialty. No? Of course, here in the Philippines, you will have to use that health information to comply with the reporting requirements of DOH. No? When they require to report non-communicable diseases, other diseases. Of course, for managing PhilHealth claims or our national health insurance system, no? You have to submit a lot of records. So these are just some of the uses of health information in the health setting or in a hospital. Now, how does technology enable or improve these processes? So here, when you become doctors or the physicians here, you know that if you are filing a PhilHealth claim, if there is no hospital information system, you will have to fill in a lot of forms. So there on your screen, you'll see some of the information that will have to be submitted to the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation. Have to provide, essentially replicate what are in the patient's medical records. No? You'll have to provide history again. You'll have to show your physical examination. You'll have to show the course in the ward. And you'll have to submit a lot of information about the patients in order to process claims. So if you're gonna do this manually, can you imagine how long it would take? If it takes a long time, it also means that it would take a long time for a hospital to be reimbursed. The reimbursement to the hospital will take a long time, and imagine also if, because it's manually written, there may be errors. No? The claims can be denied. In worst case scenarios, this might even lead to administrative complaints. So this is where technology comes in. No? Technology that enables will automate these processes and improve the way that claims are being processed in a hospital, and eventually help in the financial risk protection of patients, no? Because you know that the processes are going smoothly. Okay. But also, with the use of technology and all its potential benefits, there are also risks. During this pandemic, because of the digital transformation has been fast-tracked, there are also a lot of privacy incidents that happened. No? For instance, video conferencing platforms have been hacked. No? And accounts are being sold in the dark web. And these are just some examples. Others are there will be unauthorized access in meetings. So now we have the term Zoom bombing. Okay. There have been locally proliferation of fake Facebook accounts, no? Which came after several universities were hacked. No? Their information systems were hacked. So hacking there were a lot of incidents of hacking during this pandemic. And of course, there were also warnings from a lot of companies. No? Some of the scams that were reported did not all happen electronically. There were even actual persons trying to obtain information from people for purposes of getting their information, and maybe it had an effect on the benefits or that they were supposed to claim. No? So we have here, for instance, an airline already sending out publications warning their customers to be careful about fake sites that offer promotional fares. So these are just some of the risks. No? And why is this? No? Because information is valuable. When you get information, you might be a victim of identity theft or identity fraud. It may lead to financial losses. But I think the most critical one is that sometimes it really affects things that it may lead to harassment or discrimination. So on a more individual level, I'll give you an example of what happened here. So here we have a patient who's after a release of a report from a local government that the patient was found to have a COVID positive result. Actually here, her name was not even mentioned, no? But she reported that after that disclosure of the COVID positive patients in her locality, she suddenly received a lot of messages. She received a lot of messages, and then some of the comments there were hurtful. No? Of course, this is in Filipino. She said, ang daming nag-message sa akin. Ang sabi nila, ikaw ba to? Positive ka na ba? Her pictures went online. They were doxing her. They were showing pictures of her saying that this is the person who tested positive. So she suffered emotional distress and trauma just because information about her was disclosed. So what you can see here is that from identity theft and identity fraud to actually being directly affected in terms of receiving harassment or discrimination because of information. So imagine all information that are being collected by health professionals or in a health facility, or essentially health information. These information are sensitive in nature. So any unauthorized and unlawful disclosure could lead to harm to individuals. And this is where data privacy comes in. We know with the combined power of information and technology, we stand to benefit a lot. But how do we manage the risks? This is probably why the late Senator Edgardo Angara, in sponsoring the Data Privacy Act, he said that in this digital era, information is the currency of power. It's valuable, coveted, but at a very high risk. So this is the guiding principle of the Data Privacy Act. It proceeds from an understanding and an acknowledgement that information is valuable. Information about individuals needs to be protected. Okay. So now let's talk about the Data Privacy Act. So the Data Privacy Act, I usually, when I talk about it, I begin by talking about the right to privacy. So what is the right to privacy? The most popular definition of the right to privacy is the right to be let alone. It was coined by Justice Brandeis of the US Supreme Court. It's considered as a very comprehensive right and a right valued by most civilized men. They say that the right to privacy goes directly into a person's individuality, personhood, human dignity. When you talk about privacy, these are the usual terms that would come about. Privacy goes to the appeals to the higher sentiments and needs of an individual. Of course, the Data Privacy Act is concerned about one aspect of privacy, that of the privacy of information, or data privacy. Data privacy is essentially having the ability to control information about you. For health professionals, privacy is not a new term. Even before the Data Privacy Act in the Philippines, doctors have the Hippocratic Oath. What does the Hippocratic Oath say? This already acknowledges the right of patients to privacy and the corresponding obligations of health professionals to maintain the confidentiality of information they learn about their patients. So it's nothing new for the health sector. When you talk about privacy, privacy is critical to developing trust between physicians and patients. But the Data Privacy Act is not just about confidentiality of information, or keeping things private, as you would probably say. It's more than that. It's about all the other principles of data protection. It means not just protecting the confidentiality of data, but actually protecting the personal information so that individuals can be protected from likely harms of unauthorized or unlawful use of information. This is not to say that the right to privacy is absolute. Or what does that mean? It does not mean that you have to stop using information, or that you have to stop benefiting from the use of personal information. It doesn't mean you're no longer allowed to use information so that you could do research. It doesn't mean that you can't use information to develop data-driven policies. What it only says is that we have to support free flow of information, but at the same time, we have to always remember that the right of an individual to informational privacy has to be protected. Okay. So the Data Privacy Act in general will apply to the processing of personal information. When you say processing, This means collection. When you collect data, such as when a patient comes in and you record his or her blood pressure, you take his medical history, you're collecting information. If you enter the data of a patient in a hospital information system, then you're collecting the information as well. You will be using the information, you will be sharing it. You transfer information from a health facility to the National Health Insurance Corporation so that they will be able to reimburse claims that are filed by the hospital. Then, of course, you store the information. If the hospital is still using, for instance, paper records, then the information may be stored in filing cabinets. If they are already electronic records, then they will be stored in a data server, or they may be stored in the cloud somewhere. And from storage, you also dispose of data. So this is the data's life cycle. And as long as you're doing something with the personal information, that's processing. And generally, that means the Data Privacy Act will apply. Okay, you have to be processing personal information. So what is personal information or personal data? It's any information from which the identity of an individual is apparent. So what does this mean? If a particular set of information or an information can lead to the identity of a person, or based on that information, the person can be identifiable, then that will be considered personal information. So this does not mean that, a name is always required. Sometimes, even without the name, all the information in a data set, for instance, will already lead to the identity of the person without requiring any name. So that data set still remains to be considered personal information, for which the processing of which the Data Privacy Act will apply. Now, in the Philippines, personal information is classified as personal information that is not sensitive and sensitive personal information. Why is there a distinction? There is a distinction because sensitive personal information is a special category of data which generally requires a higher degree of protection. So now let's look at another form from PhilHealth. This is the membership form. When you become to be covered by PhilHealth, you have to be a member, and PhilHealth will collect. These are some of the information that PhilHealth will collect in its membership form. So it will collect the name, date of birth. Okay. Now, what I want you to do for this is you have to look at the link that will be posted in the chat box. Then try to see if you can instinctively decide whether this information here or the other information in the list will be considered personal information that is not sensitive and sensitive personal information. So maybe you have 2 minutes to try and answer that link. The form will tell you the answer after you complete answering it. So is name sensitive personal information? Is place of birth sensitive personal information? So you try and check it out. Okay, I'll give you 2 minutes. Okay, are you done? Can you say if most of you are done already? So when you say male or female, is that sensitive personal information? When you ask about the civil status of a person, does it mean it's sensitive personal information? Again, the reason for the distinction is because if it's sensitive personal information, then it has to be protected more. The underlying principle is the belief that if it's sensitive personal information, then if it is compromised, it means it will result to higher harm. There's more harm to data subjects if the sensitive personal information is compromised. Okay, so are you done? So did you get it all correct? Okay. Did you get the classification correct? So here, no, in the Philippines, there's a list provided in the law for what would be considered as sensitive personal information. Of course, information about an individual's health, genetic or sexual life, that's considered sensitive personal information. So one distinction, for instance, is if it is personal information that is not of a sensitive nature, it's not sensitive personal information, then generally the processing of it is, the rules applicable are more lax. Whereas if it's sensitive personal information, then its processing is generally prohibited unless you meet certain criteria. Also, if what is compromised is sensitive personal information as opposed to personal information that is not sensitive, what will happen is that the penalties will also be higher. Okay. So here, information that relates to a particular number issued by government agencies, that will be considered sensitive personal information under the Philippine law. No? So if it's about ethnic origin, marital status, age, all these are considered as sensitive personal information under the Data Privacy Act. Okay, so if you're processing personal information, whether it's sensitive or personal information that is not sensitive, it will be covered by the Data Privacy Act. The principles of the Data Privacy Act are usually almost the same as other data protection regulation in jurisdictions. So here, the Data Privacy Act says that if you're processing personal information, then you have to adhere to data privacy principles. You have to implement security measures for the protection of the personal data, and you have to uphold the rights of data subjects. In the healthcare setting, in the health sector, the data subject would often be the patients, because it is their data that is usually collected, processed, used, stored, and later on disposed of. Okay, so let's go one by one in these obligations. So the general data privacy principles can be summarized as the principle of transparency, the principle of legitimate purpose, and the principle of proportionality. Okay, so what is transparency? Transparency is the principle that says that the data subject must be aware of the extent, first, of the fact that his or her information is being processed, the extent of these processing, any risks and safeguards, and information that relates to the processing of data that relates to him. So how do you know that you're complying with the principle of transparency? One question to ask is, if the data subjects find out what you're doing with their personal information, will they be unfairly surprised? So if the patients find out, for instance, that you're actually using you're reporting their information or sharing their data across different facilities, will they be unfairly surprised? So if they are unfairly surprised, then it means that you might not be adhering to the principle of transparency, which is all about openness of the processing of personal information. So one way to show transparency, as you would see in a lot of hospitals, they will have a privacy notice. So a privacy notice is something that that is accessible to patients, so that they will be informed of how the hospital, for instance, uses their personal information. So that's the principle of transparency. Transparency is particularly important if you're processing personal information and you didn't necessarily obtain the consent of patients. For instance, COVID-19 patients, there is a mandatory reporting requirement. So this information will have to be reported to the Department of Health through the official contact tracing teams. So even if consent is not obtained from patients because it is required by law, it's still important that patients are aware that this type of processing is happening. So transparency is important, no? In many situations wherein personal information is being processed. The requirement of transparency is, of course, different from the requirement of consent. When you talk about consent, you're talking about one of the criteria for legitimate processing of personal information. So the second data privacy principle after transparency is legitimate purpose. Legitimate purpose means that the processing of information shall be compatible with the purpose that is known to the data subject. So when you process personal information, you generally have to ask, what is the basis of my processing? So even if, for instance, you're a medical student and you get assigned to the wards and you're collecting information, you're using it, you're reporting it during rounds or grand rounds or in a conference, you have to know what is the basis of your processing. Understanding and knowing what your basis of processing is adhering to the principle of legitimate purpose. Now, one of the criteria for processing that will make your processing of personal information lawful is consent. So when you talk about consent, if it's not clear, it will not be considered consent. Consent has to be freely given, specific, and really reflects an informed choice. So here in the Philippines, under our law, when you talk about consent for the processing of personal information, consent has to be expressed. It has to be evidenced by written, electronic, or recorded means. So consent can be obtained by having a patient actually sign a consent form. It may be recorded, such as what you would experience if, for instance, you're using the phone and calling a particular company or service, and they will tell you, they will ask for your consent, and they will tell you that the call is being recorded, and then they'll ask for your consent. So it's recording. Or electronic, no? Usually, when you download an app, you'll be asked to tick boxes to give consent to the processing of personal information. So what's important is that consent should reflect an informed choice and that it is clear, no? It's understood by the patient. But consent is not always the only criteria for processing. No? There are other criteria. For instance, in the Philippines, if the processing of personal information is for medical treatment purpose, consent is not required. This means that if you're just making the patient's medical record, you took the patient's BP, blood pressure, and you placed it in a form, the patient's patient chart, you placed it there, then you're doing it for medical treatment purpose, no? Consent is generally not required. Of course, you have to not be confused by consent required for procedures. No? This is consent for the collection, the recording, the taking note, the storing of the personal information of the patients. Now here, no, this is just to illustrate. No? There was a surgeon who posted on social media information about a surgery that he performed. There was no mention of the patient's name, no? Only the tumor that was removed from his heart and some description of the case. So you can see here, no? Patient did not expect this, no? And patient's consent was not obtained. So because of this, the patient actually complained. Again, the patient was felt a violation on his privacy, including being hurt at the comments being poked at his condition. So you can imagine that even if the doctors actually took the picture to document it for medical treatment purpose, the posting in social media is no longer for medical treatment purpose. So because it is outside medical treatment purpose, consent should have been obtained. If this happened in the Philippines, that would be the requirement, that you're supposed to obtain consent for the processing of personal information that is outside medical treatment purpose. So legitimate purpose always requires, the principle of legitimate purpose always requires that you have a basis for the processing of personal information, which could either be, number one, you have the consent of the patient, or number two, the purpose of the processing is something that is allowed by law. So just a summary table of some of the instances where here in the Philippines, consent would generally be required and where consent will not be required. So if the processing is for medical treatment, no, consent will no longer be required. In cases of emergency where the patient can give consent and the purpose is to save the life or limb of the patient, then again, consent is not required. Now, imagine if an unconscious patient goes to the emergency room and you want to start processing his personal information. You want to contact relatives, you want to be able to share his information to the blood bank so that you can get some blood. No? You don't have to wait for the patient to be conscious if it is necessary to protect his life and health. So consent, again, is not required to process his personal information. If there is a law, such as a reporting requirement, no? So here, the Department of Health requires sometimes the physician, sometimes the hospital facilities to report certain medical conditions. No? It's covered by a reporting requirement. And so you can do this even without the consent of the data subject. But for all other purposes, consent is generally required. No? If you're using it for training purpose, to train physicians, to use it for education of students, then of course, consent would have to be obtained. Research in general, consent is also necessary. I said there it's in general because sometimes research without consent of the data subject is possible if it follows ethical principles. So here in the Philippines, you would usually have to have a research proposal approved by an institutional review board, and you will justify why consent is not necessary. The justification would be if there really would be no harm to the data subject and no decisions would be made that would affect the data subject in that particular research where you are asking for a waiver of the consent requirement. Okay. Disclosure of data to any person other than the patient is, you need consent. No? So usually, if someone other than the patient, for instance, is requesting a medical abstract, you would have to ensure that that person requesting that abstract in behalf of the patient is actually authorized to request for that information. Okay. So this is the summary table for when consent is not required. So when you talk about consent or finding the legal basis for the processing of personal information, that is the principle of legitimate purpose. The third principle is the principle of proportionality. What does the principle of proportionality mean? No? In Filipino, this means dapat sakto lang. No? It means you have to collect only information that is necessary for the particular purpose. It means that you should ensure that you don't use information that are not necessary. No? You limit it to what is essential. You also do not store personal information longer than necessary. For instance, a medical record of a patient who died, you don't have to keep it for 50 years after the patient's death, because it no longer serves any purpose. So the retention or the storage of the data has to be only in accordance with the purpose for which such information will be used. So this is the principle of proportionality. It applies to whether you're collecting data, you're using data, or you're retaining or storing personal information of patients. Okay, so as an example, first, given this data set, let's say I'm presenting it to you now, would this data set be considered as personal information? Okay. What do you think? Can you chat it? Do you type it in the chat? Do you think that this data set, everything here, from this information to this picture, will this be considered as personal information? Personal information is when the identity of a person is when the person can be identified, or identified or identifiable information about the patient. Okay. So what do you think? Okay, I'm seeing the answers, no? A lot feel that this will no longer be considered personal information. that question is very important because, of course, if something is not considered personal information, then it means you can you no longer have, it's no longer covered by the Data Privacy Act, no? Because the processing, only the processing of personal information is covered by the Data Privacy Act. Now, I understand why some people will think that it's no longer personal information. No? In fact, I think a lot of the answers are all no. No? But this particular data set will still be considered personal information. Why? No? There's a picture. No? If you post this, for instance, if you take a screenshot of this slide that I'm showing now, and you shared it in social media, and the patient sees it, or someone who knows the patient sees it, will that person be able to identify the patient? There is a possibility that the patient can be identified. There is an initial, particular age, particular description of an incident from which the injury was obtained, and there's a picture. So this information in your screen can be considered personal information, no? Because the definition of personal information is any information about an identified or identifiable person. So what can you do? No? In the US, they have the safe harbor rules from HIPAA, which provide certain information that can be taken out of a data set to de-identify it. No? Specific dates, for instance, should be taken out. Pictures should not be used. Specific identifiable numbers. No? But I showed you this slide also to illustrate the principle of proportionality. So let's say me, I will be presenting this to you in this webinar. Do I actually need to put all this information to relay the data, no? The sentiment? No? So for instance, no? And this applies even when you're presenting. Of course, if you're using patients' photographs, consent should be obtained, especially if you're using it for publications, you're using it for presentations. No? But just look at the data set and what can be done. When you're presenting a case, for instance, you don't actually need the actual initials of a patient. No? Any random letters and your presentation or what you're trying to say will not even be affected. No? Sometimes age might not be necessary for the particular disease. Sometimes it is. So it depends on the particular case. So if there's no need to include those particular information when you're using the personal information of patients for another purpose other than medical treatment, then those information can be removed and changed with something more general that will not lead to the identity of a person. So that's what proportionality is about. That's how you exercise proportionality. You have to ask, do I still need this information? Will my purpose be affected if I don't use certain parts of this information? In fact, no, I'm going to share with you some guidance in using information in research or for publications. So here, no, they say that photographs in general, when you use it, you have to get the consent of the patient. Even photographs that include an ear, eye, facial hair, or skin lesion may not seem to reveal the person's identity, but the test of anonymity is whether the patient could recognize his or her own image. Some the examples that they gave is, for instance, a particular tattoo, a particular nail art, particular jewelry. No? If those are, they should, photographs of patients should be taken in such a way that you limit identification of the patient. If you're using the photograph for a journal, for a presentation, you want to crop any identifying features. In fact, they say that if the photograph is not necessary for that particular paper, you should not even use it anymore. No? So these guidelines are actually reflect application of the principle of proportionality. Okay. So to sum up the data privacy principles, do you still remember them? The principle of transparency or openness, the principle of legitimate purpose, and the principle of proportionality. So you ask, will the data subject be unfairly surprised by the processing? Does the processing have legal basis or data subject consent? Is the processing necessary and proportional to the purpose of the processing? Do I maintain data quality? And will the personal information be retained longer than necessary? So these sums up the considerations when you talk about data privacy principles. Now, very briefly, another obligation is implementing security measures. In other jurisdictions, this is called the security principle or the integrity and confidentiality principle. When you're processing personal information, you want to ensure that there are organizational, physical, and technical security measures. Organizational security measures refers to any policy or procedure intended for the protection of personal data. Physical is how you limit access. For instance, access to workstations, access to where data is being stored, access to a data center, even access to a facility, how you are able to limit it to minimize risks of compromising the personal information that is being collected. And of course, technical security measure. So when you're using, for instance, an open source information system, you have to make sure that security measures are in place. It means, there are some forms of control to make sure that only authorized person can access the system. So when you implement the security measures in general, when you talk about organizational, physical, and technical security measures, the goals of implementing them is the CIA of data: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality means that you want to prevent any unauthorized access to the personal information, particularly health information. Integrity means you want to prevent any unauthorized changes. Imagine what would happen if anyone can just access the hospital information system and change information about the medical condition of patients. That would be a disaster. Then availability. You want to make sure that the personal information or the patient's records, as an example, would be available at the time that it is needed. Imagine if a patient wanted to claim for benefits under social insurance or to request for benefits from the government, and they would need a medical abstract. And if they request it from you or from the hospital or from the facility, the record is suddenly gone, cannot be located. They're not using or it has been erased from the database of the hospital. The availability of data was not maintained. Again, it will have consequences. As I mentioned, data privacy is not just about confidentiality, but protection of personal information. And this includes maintaining the integrity and availability of personal data. So in using a hospital information system, from the time that data is collected, you want to make sure that the patient is informed of the fact that his data is being collected and to whom it will be shared, like sharing it with other government agencies. As I mentioned, usually this is done in the hospital by having a privacy notice, providing information about how information is being collected, what types of information are being collected from the patient, how they will be used, to whom they will be shared. So those are some of the contents of a privacy notice. It goes at the time of the collection. So the security measures have to be implemented at every stage of the data life cycle. When you're storing the information, how secure is it? When you're transferring data, how secure is it? For instance, one way of securing transfers of data is by ensuring that as the data is being transferred, it is encrypted, so that in case someone is able to gain access to that data, they will still not be able to read it easily. They will still not be able to gain access to the information because it has been encrypted, or only those who knows the password will be able to read it. Same with storage. Imagine if your system already is no longer secure, it has been hacked, and the data being stored there is also not protected. Meaning if they gain access to the system, they are able to exfiltrate your data, get your data. They are in plain text and easily readable. No encryption has been applied. So the risks of harm to the data subject become magnified. So this is what security measures are about. You have to implement security measures from the time the data is collected all throughout the data's life cycle to the time that it is stored and disposed of. So sometimes it's not just about IT systems. A lot of breaches or privacy violations happen not just because of hacking, but because maybe of people, maybe because of lack of procedures in a particular facility. So for example, this happened in another country, and you can imagine that this may usually be happening in health facilities. How sure are we that everyone in the hospital knows of their obligations of confidentiality? In this case, a health staff who actually knew a patient who went to the hospital sent text messages to that patient's girlfriend informing her about the patient's condition. So it's sometimes those unintended disclosures, or sometimes maybe no one realizes that these are not supposed to be done. You're not supposed to talk about your patients with other people, no matter how interesting the case may be. That's actually a violation. So usually what they do, everyone working in the hospital here in the Philippines, for instance, they are being asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. That reinforces on the part of all those who process personal information in a health facility their obligation to maintain the confidentiality of personal data. Okay. Again, security is not only a security breach does not only happen because your system has been hacked. Sometimes your devices may be stolen, and if they contain personal information, that's also a breach. Now I'm asking you, for instance, if you lose your laptop now or your smartphone, what types of information will be compromised? Do you have any security measures in your laptops or smartphones? Are they password protected? Have you activated the application wherein you can remotely wipe the contents of your laptop or your smart devices in case they are stolen? So it may be as simple as a stolen laptop, and it might already mean that thousands of patients' information will be breached. In this particular case, the affected individuals were offered a year-long subscription for credit monitoring. So really, when you talk about security measures, what we know in medicine as prevention is better than cure usually applies. It's better to strengthen systems, to implement all the security measures than wait for a problem or a breach to happen, because then the data subjects will be harmed and it will entail more costs and more damages. Okay. And finally, the final obligation is the rights of data subjects. In the Philippines, the rights of data subjects are they have a right to be informed about the fact that their information is being processed. It's a lot like transparency. They have a right to object to processing of personal information. They have a right to request access. So patients may request copies of medical abstract. If there is inaccuracies or erroneous entries in their medical information, they have a right to request for correction. They have a right to request for erasure of their personal information if it's no longer necessary or if it has been unlawfully obtained. They have a right to file a complaint, and if their complaints are valid, they have a right to damages. There's also a right to data portability, which means that if information is collected in an electronic format, it's stored in an electronic format, then patients will also have a right to request for that same information in an electronic format as well. Okay. So here on your screen are just some examples of some privacy problems that happened or have been filed in the local regulator. So there have been concerns in files, in boxes, in corridor. When you use records as scratch paper, maybe it was a wrong print, or maybe those are records that are to be thrown away, but they are used as scratch paper. So on one side there, you're writing certain information. On the other side is patient information. There was also a complaint about the right to access, no, because there was a delay in providing a medical abstract. No? Other concerns about posting in social media of information about patients, releasing of medical abstract of a patient to someone other than the patient, no, without proper authority. There were also complaints about a lost chart. No? Patient was requesting access to information, and the hospital replied by saying that despite due diligence, they could not find the records. So these are all within the ambit of the concerns in data protection. This was filed in the Regulatory Commission of the Philippines, the PRC. Physicians were talking about a patient in an elevator, and one of the people in the elevator was the patient's relative. Sometimes when you think about privacy violations, you may think that no one will commit privacy violations, but they actually happen frequently, often without us meaning to. No one wants to violate a privacy, but sometimes it happens. So even if there is a law, what the real challenge in data protection is how to change culture, how to make sure that it is embedded in day-to-day operations. And a big part of this is we have to understand what the Data Privacy Act is for. If you're doing compliance with data privacy, for instance, just because it's in the law, or just because, like in the Philippines, the penalties are quite high, I don't think that's the right motivation. You comply with data privacy obligations, you comply and maintain data privacy, you respect patients' rights to data privacy for the simplest of reasons, because it's the right thing to do. And it's because it's what our patients deserve. So I think in all these compliance efforts, when you talk about data privacy, when you talk about health information privacy in particular, the ethics aspect of data privacy is very important. And in fact, all these things that I've talked about, they are all part of ethical obligations. So do you remember the general principles, general ethical principles? So I'll give you a scenario that actually happened just last year. So here, there was a patient, a video of a patient that went viral in social media. It was a 1 minute, 25 seconds video wherein there was a patient lying on a stretcher who was very bloody. He was bleeding all around. There was blood all around the stretcher. And he was very agitated. Sometimes he tried to stand up, and there was no one assisting him. He appeared for some netizens that he was begging for help. In fact, when that patient died, a lot of the comments in social media was that the hospital abandoned the patient. They left the patient to die. The ones who actually took that video was a nurse in the facility who in one report, not the one cited here, in one report it was said that she actually shared the video of that patient to other to other nurses, and one of those nurses posted that video on social media. So they were all hospital staff who made this possible. So of course, data privacy wise, there were a lot of privacy violations here. But now think of it from the perspective of ethics in data processing. So what principles and what ethical principles may have been violated here? You think about it, and then again, you chat it in the chat box. What ethical principles? Ano ba yung what are the ethical principles? You talk about the principle of autonomy, the principle of beneficence, the principle of non-maleficence, and the principle of justice. What ethical principles were violated when this happened? This is just to show you that data privacy obligations also correspond to ethical principles. Sige. Let me may line. Let me talk about the ethical principles so you can review it. So we have the principle of autonomy. The principle of autonomy is founded on the right of individuals to self-determination. In data privacy, this means patients as data subjects have the right to an informed choice. It's a lot like the legitimate purpose principle. So there, in that particular case that I showed you, was the principle of autonomy respected. So it's both an ethical violation and a data privacy violation because the patient's consent was not taken before his video, particularly in a very vulnerable situation. He was fighting for his life there, was taken. His video was taken and it was posted in social media. So there was no respect of the patient's autonomy. Principle of non-maleficence, which means you do no harm. I think do no harm principle. So again, in that scenario, you can see that that actually caused harm to the patient. Again, we show you the comparison that you have to comply with data privacy obligations in order to protect the patient. So here, there was unauthorized processing. So this unauthorized processing, which is a data privacy violation, was also a failure to respect the principle of non-maleficence because the act of taking the video of the patient and posting it in social media actually caused harm to the patient. And later on, even the patient's family. Okay. Then beneficence, you do good. As opposed to doing no harm, the principle of beneficence means you're thinking of the best interests of the individual, whether what you're doing will benefit the individual. So again, in that case, was the principle of beneficence respected? What possible benefit can that do to the patient that his state was recorded that way and even shared for the public to see? There's no benefit. And of course, the other ethical principle is the principle of justice, which considers fairness and equity. When you talk about data privacy, this also usually involves balancing of risks. For instance, you want to use a hospital information system because it will definitely improve processes in the hospital, improving maybe financial risk protection of patients. There's so many benefits in using technology to process information, but at the same time, there are risks. Even the most secure system, for instance, can be breached. So you have to balance the risks and the possible benefits. So this is one of the considerations of the principle of justice as it relates to data privacy. It's usually about fairness. So again, when you look at that scenario that I told you about, where is fairness there? Looking into all the ethical principles, it seems that all these were ignored in the act of recording and posting in social media a patient in a vulnerable state. So I hope that you were able to see the connection between the principles, ethical principles, and the principles in data privacy. So there's autonomy, which respects the rights of data subject and the value of informed choice. Non-maleficence, which means doing no harm, which is the reason why you want to protect personal information of patients, because you want to prevent harm you want to prevent harm to them if their information is processed without authority or against the law. And you want to process personal information in a way that would also be beneficial to the patient. So that's beneficence. And of course, you talk about accountability, actually being responsible for the protection of the personal information of patients. That is justice. Okay. So all these lessons from these modules, from the first part to the last part, the general goal of all this is to ensure that we are able to maximize the benefits from the advancements in technology and the availability of information, because we stand to gain so much from health information. It's very valuable and it's very useful and it's a game changer. So it helps in policy. The more information will help us treat our patients better. So all these benefits, we want to maximize it, but at the same time, we want to minimize harms to data subject. I always think that when we talk about protecting our patients, doing our best for our patients, that includes protecting them from harm and ensuring that they do not suffer because of misuse of their personal information. So at the end of the day, it all goes into accountability and the ethical use of personal data. Just to repeat, we want to do this because it's the right thing to do. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture. If you have questions.
Yes, thank you, Attorney Ivy. There's one question here from one of our students. I just wanted to clarify on which Philippine agency is in charge in mediating health data privacy issues that are violating the Data Privacy Act. Additionally, are they the same government agency in charge for the safekeeping and gatekeeping of such patient medical records, both electronically and in print?
Yeah, the Philippine agency in charge of implementing the Data Privacy Act is the National Privacy Commission. Okay, so it's an office located at the PICC now. So it's a website if you want to learn more about what it's doing and the issuances of the National Privacy Commission. Its website is at privacy.gov.ph. Of course, the Department of Health also has issuances related to health information privacy. Okay, so I hope I answered that question.
Yes, thank you, Attorney. Are there any more questions from our participants before we wrap up?
Masyado na bang sobra yung time? Would you like to end with a game? Is there like 5 minutes more?
Yes, please feel free po, Attorney.
Okay, for those of you, I want you to, let me just set it up. Go to kahoot.it. Let me type it here. And let's have a short game. Okay, go to that site, maybe open another tab or use your smartphone, but you can just open another tab. Then you have to look at the screen and enter the game pin. Okay, I'll share my screen again. Okay, so this is just a game, If you don't get the correct answer, it's okay. No one will know. So, okay, you enter the game pin, then just, enter a code name. You see the screen now? The questions will be flashed on the screen and you're just supposed to pick the answer, from your other tab or from your smart device. Okay. All right. I'll put in a little music. So when we answer this, we have to dance a little like this. Okay, so we have a lot of participants in the game. Okay, so I think I'll start now. Okay, so we have some questions. Okay, so the question is here, The Institutional Review Board allows the student to do a chart review of previous patients without obtaining their consent. What ethical principle is involved? Sometimes that's done in an institution. You want to request waiver of consent. Okay, let's see. Oh no, no one answered justice. Okay, obtaining consent is of course about autonomy, no? But here you will not get consent. So you are actually balancing two principles, okay? The benefits and the harms, and that's about justice. Don't worry, this is the hard question there in the in the set. Okay. Okay. No one's in the lead. Let's see the second question. Okay. What ethical principle are we talking about when we say we want to maximize the benefits while minimizing risks of harm to patients? I think 22 answers in already. Okay. Or justice. No? Justice is about fairness. No? You want to be able to, despite the risks, you want to continue doing something because it will benefit. It will have benefits for the greater good. No? So usually that's what justice is about. Okay. So let's see who's in the lead. Okay, Ruru, congratulations. You're in the lead. Next question. Okay, no? Before the doctor enters information, the doctor wanted to ask about the security features of the hospital information system. So when the doctor does this, what principle, no, is he thinking about? Okay, non-maleficence. No? You don't want to harm the patient. So you want to make sure that even as you're processing the personal information, the patient will not be harmed in the process. That's why you ask for the security features. No? Is it something that can easily be hacked? So, correct, non-maleficence. Let's see. Okay, Ruru is still in the lead. Okay, let's see the next question. Okay, ask patient to agree to a risky surgical procedure which aims to be life-saving, but could also worsen his condition. So what principle is this? Okay, yes, the principle of autonomy. It's about the patient's choice. Sometimes as a doctor, you might be faced with these situations. A surgery can save the life of a patient, but the patient might even die during the surgery because it's a risky procedure. Or this goes also with a lot of treatments. Patients may not, whether a patient would agree to a clinical trial for cancer, no guarantees. So usually it is here where the patient's decision will be very important, and thus the principle of autonomy in ethics. Looks like Ruru isn't really giving up the lead. So let's go okay, I think we're halfway. Okay, the hospital ensures that only authorized persons can access the open source hospital information system. So what is this, in data privacy? When you want to ensure that no one else will access the open source hospital information system. What is being practiced here? Okay, yes, it's security. You want to implement security measures to prevent unauthorized access. Okay, see? Okay, there's a fire sign beside J. He has the highest answer streak of 3, but Ruru remains to be in the lead. Let's see the next question. Okay, so I think these are the final few questions. What principle is involved here? When you do it anyway, even if the patient is not unconscious and the patient cannot give consent. principle of beneficence. What's good for the patient? Will it benefit the patient? So this was the primary consideration. That's why you treat patients even if the patient did not give us. Oh, wow. Jay is in the lead. The streak with the highest answer streak of 4. Okay, let's see the next question. The patient health data is shared with PhilHealth to process claims as provided in the PhilHealth law. What data privacy principle is involved here? You process the patient's data as provided in the PhilHealth law. Okay? Legitimate purpose. Parang mas marami kayong most correct answers were relate to the data privacy principles. Yes, because processing has to have basis, whether it's consent or some authority from law. So it's legitimate purpose. Okay. Oh, new lead. Okay. Last 3 questions. Okay. When you dispose outpatient records after 10 years from patient's last consultation, what principle is this? Okay. Proportionality. Correct. You don't store it longer than necessary. Okay. Jay is back in the lead. Okay, I think it's a close fight between Jay, Agretsuko, and Ruru. So, okay. Last 2 questions. Okay. Patient requests for a medical abstract from his previous admission. What right is this? Okay, correct. It's the right to access. You request access. You get a copy of the medical abstract. That's one of the rights of a data subject. And for the final question, let's see. Okay, Jay is still in the lead. Final question. Let's see who will be number 1. Hospital has a privacy notice that says that patient information may be shared with DOH and PhilHealth. So what principle is this? Okay, yes, it's the principle of transparency, because the emphasis here is the privacy notice. I think the others answered legitimate purpose because it's the purpose of processing, but it's about the privacy notice. Okay, so let's see who's the winner. Rue is 3rd place. Jay is 2nd place. Ooh, can we know who the top 3 are? May runner-up tayo, si PNN and Ruru. Can you ask them who are our winners? Okay, I took a picture of the winners. Okay, so who are our winners? Ruru. Hi, Jonathan Chan. Have you heard this lecture before? Okay. And Agretsuko is the number 1. Congratulations to the winner. You only win bragging rights for winning this this game. Okay, so I think that's it for this module. I hope you had fun and you learned a lot.
Thank you once again, Attorney Ivy, and to all our participants. So before we end, let me just call on Miss Christine Pascual.
Hi everyone, good evening. So tonight, we'd like to express our heartfelt thanks to Attorney Ivy Patdu for sharing with us her knowledge and expertise on health data privacy. So it's a refreshing and an interesting session, Attorney. So we really enjoyed the quiz. We've come to realize in this session how the practice of data privacy is really critical in implementing health information systems and most importantly, in protecting the best interest of our patients. So, once again, this event is in partnership with the Advocates for Consciousness and Social Involvement Society at AMSA and the Innovation Management and Business Association. So we'd like to thank again our participants for attending today's session, and we hope to see you tomorrow night, same time, 8 p.m. Manila time, for our last module, interfacing with openIMIS. So we will witness tomorrow how national health insurance processes are managed in an open source information system. So don't forget to prepare your laptops tomorrow night. See you tomorrow night, and good evening, everyone. Thank you again. Bye.